As I've said before, I think Blackbeard, Marshall D. Teach, will have the Zoan Fruit ability that will allow him to turn into the mythical depiction of the devil, or at least how the devil is presented in One Piece. With that being said, I think I need to cover the Blackbeard Pirates Jolly Roger, because as I've said before a long time ago, I do believe it's there to represent the Blackbeard Pirates' goals and Blackbeard's ambitions. What we find out at the tail end of Egghead is that Blackbeard aims to conquer the world. His ambitions are the world, similar to how Roxy Zebek wanted to be king of the world. Keeping that in mind, we can break down the Jolly Roger like this. The three skulls are there to represent the three types of Devil Fruit. That's the most Occam's razor answer, because he's the first person in history to have two. Most likely he'll be the first person in history to have all three. Secondly, the 8 crossbone points on the Jolly Roger are there to represent the 8 directions that exist. So north, south, east, west, northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest. So what it's saying as a whole is that I, Blackbeard, with these 3 powers, will conquer all 8 corners of the world absolutely. That's what I think it means. I think that's the most obvious and concrete interpretation of what his Jolly Roger stands for. He, with the 3 most powerful Devil Fruit abilities of each category, will conquer the world. So far, he has the most powerful Logia, an ability that can presumably eat other abilities and nullify abilities in the darkness fruit. Then he has the most powerful Paramecia type Devil Fruit, the Tremor fruit, as for all intents and purposes, for overall damage output, it is the strongest. Now we're waiting to see what type of Zoan Devil Fruit he will get. But based on how things have been going, especially looking at Egghead with the powers of the 5 elders, the most powerful Zoan Fruit most likely is a mythical type Zoan Fruit. But with that being said, now let's talk about how people Blackbeard meets, or whom he's involved with narratively, meaning people who have fought him, people who have talked about him, etc. Pretty much foreshadows what abilities he will get. So, when we first hear about Blackbeard, he is terrorizing the Drum Kingdom, causing their king, Wapol, to flee. A very funny thing that I don't think people really take out the time to think about is that Blackbeard and Wapol are almost the same character on a lot of points. First of all, they come into the story wearing white, and they are from white organizations, I guess you could say. Wapol is wearing his white walkie hood and robe, and he is the king of the Drum Kingdom, a white kingdom covered in snow. Blackbeard, or Marshall D. Teach, when we first see him, is wearing a white dress shirt and is fresh off from being from the Whitebeard Pirates. So in both situations, both of them come from organizations of white. Then, as time goes on, that white becomes black as Wapol goes through his trials and tribulations and then becomes the king of the evil Black Drum Kingdom and wears a black walkie hood and cape. Then Blackbeard becomes a proper pirate to the world and is known as, well, Blackbeard of the Blackbeard Pirates, Admiral or Commodore of the Blackbeard Pirates, right? And then he gets his own land, his own emperor hideout called the Beehive, Hachinosu, full of Lead Island, etc., right? So in both situations, both of them come from something into nothing to drag themselves up into something again. Another thing that I don't think a lot of people realize is that the Munch Munch fruit, as it's presented in the franchise, and the Darkness fruit are oddly similar. Even though one is a paramecia and one is a logia, both of them allow the user to consume things. Wapple with the Munch Munch fruit more literally, and then Blackbeard with the Darkness fruit more, I guess, metaphorically, because Blackbeard's vortex sucks in everything, whereas Wapple's mouth eats everything. Then you could say both of them can become what they eat as well. Wapple, when he eats something, he literally becomes what he has eaten. And then Blackbeard, in a metaphorical sense, literally is darkness. And he ate the Darkness fruit. So he literally became what he ate. But on a flip side to that, if my hypothesis is correct and what the Darkness fruit allows Blackbeard to do, I do believe the Darkness fruit is the reason for him being able to have two types of devil fruit powers at the same time, because he ate the essence of the Tremor fruit as it was trying to escape Whitebeard's corpse. So he ate the essence and then became a Tremor man. So in that way too, he became what he ate. This parallels to how Wapple is treated in non-canon material, because in movie 9, which covers the events of the Drum Kingdom arc, but with Robin and Frankie being there as opposed to Vivian Carew, we see Wapple eat his non-canon brother, who too was a Delphi user and then was able to use his abilities. So I find that very odd that in both ways they have been portrayed in being able to consume devil fruit powers in that way and then use them. Also in SBS, it was said that Wapple could eat the Straw Hat crew and combine them into one being. So again, we have him eating devil fruit users. With that being said, moving forward, of course, Blackbeard fights Whitebeard, right? And takes his ability. So then he inherits the most powerful ability known to the Paramecia class, and that of the Tremor fruit. This is interesting because he has been around Whitebeard for years. So in observing him, of course, he would know how to use the ability. But with that being said, I think everyone else that he has fought up to this point, and or whom he has captured, leads us to what his Zoan fruit ability will actually be. Because the funny thing about this is that the other significant characters that he fights are Ace, Magellan, Law, and that's about it. So I think in that way, all of these characters bundled up are a reference to the devil, or at least the devil as he is in One Piece. Oh, another character I forgot that he has a strong relationship with is Moria, and I do believe Moria sets it off, because when Kuma comes to Thriller Bark, he is there to discuss Blackbeard becoming a warlord, right? And he tells Moria that his bounty is originally 0 and et cetera, et cetera. But what's so funny about that is Blackbeard ends up capturing Moria later on in the time skip. But that's not really the important part. The important part is Moria talking about ores. Now, when he's speaking about ores, he refers to him as the devil himself, the continent puller, etc., etc. To give a full synopsis, here it is. So, in chapter 456, and translations do differ, but I'll come to that point when we get to it. But Moria says, as he's walking in the zombie number 900 special hall freezer, upon finding his corpse in the land of ice, I couldn't stop trembling. I could not believe that something so fearsome wreaked havoc in the seas 500 years ago. The nations that fell at his hands were taken whole, island and everything, and he created a nation of villains. The one who created the famous legend of the continent pillar was right before my eyes. Now, it's time for your revival. In all of history, you are the only one known as the berserker warrior they call the Beast, Oars. Now, in some translations and what I see on the One Piece Wikia, the Beast is replaced with like the devil. So in all of history, he is the one being called the devil. With that being said, what's very funny about Moria describing Oars is that in the same arc, we learn that Blackbeard has become a warlord. Now, when he says that he created a nation of villains out of the islands he took, who does that sound like? That sounds like Blackbeard to me, because Blackbeard took a nation, an island belonging to a former rocks pirate, became the leader of that island, and made it his base of operations. That island, full of Lead Island, Hachinoso, is a island of villains, a nation of villains. It works like any other nation that we find out in SBS. It's just like a regular place. There's commerce and whatnot, but it is a nation of purely villains. And Blackbeard is their king, their leader, their commodore. So I find those parallels very interesting. Now, another fun tidbit that I did not know but found out very recently is that when you take this all into consideration, Oars originally comes from the North Blue, as does Law. So that's a very interesting parallel there. In addition, I think what this story is supposed to represent that Moria is talking about is that I don't think the oars that he has, the oars that we know, is the oars from the legend, because he is too small to be a continent puller. And from what we see from his descendant, Little Oars Jr. of the Whitebeard Pirates, Little Oars Jr. did not display that same level of strength in Marineford. In addition to, I find it very interesting, just as an aside, that Blackbeard is brought up in a significant way in both of those arcs. He is crowned a warlord in the Thriller Bark arc when we meet Oars, and then he betrays the world government on a grand stage in the Marineford arc where we meet Oars Jr. Just pointing that out. But I do think that the legend is in relation to a character that came before the Oars we knew, because it has been a long standing belief of mine that the Oars that we meet, the zombie, is perhaps Oars the second and not Oars the first. Oars the first presumably is the skull that is now Onigashima, which would make a lot of sense too, because then that ties back into Moria, as at that particular time, the only two characters who seem to have intimate knowledge of Kaido were Garp and Moria. Moria, who was affected by Kaido very personally. So I could see Onigashima originally being the skull of Oars the First, who is then the ancestor of Oars the Second, whom is Oars the Zombie, who is then the ancestor of Oars the Third, Little Oars Jr. of the Whitebeard Pirates. Taking that into consideration, it would make sense too for beings of that size to exist, given the giant weapons that we have seen recently. There's a giant sword in Onigashima just randomly, right, that no one uses. And then there is a giant sword actually in the land of the giants, Elbaf. It's going through the entire world tree there that makes up the body of the island. So that has to be wielded by somebody, or that has to be a thing that was crafted for someone. And I could believe that was crafted for the original Oars. Now, taking what Moria said into consideration about Ors, I think Ors, the person, meaning presumably zombie Ors' ancestor, I don't think he's actually going to matter for the story. I think the stories about him are what's going to actually matter, because we find in Egghead that devil fruits are born out of the dreams and wishes of people. So if this figure was capable of uniting several nations together into his own country of villains, and Moria knows about that as a modern day person in the One Piece world, it begs to reason that legends and stories were made up about this person giving birth to an entity, possibly the entity that we see in the mural of chapter 1138. In that mural, we see a giant figure with horns and wings holding a sun as is fighting Nika. Now, I think the power attributed to the stories of this entity have given birth to what we see in the mural, meaning that the story that Moria is talking about gave way to the power that we see on display in the mural existing. With that being said, it's possible that just like Nika, presumably based on what we read about him coming into existence during the First World, it's likely that the entity that these stories are attributed to, or the first presumably, is older than Nika. And then maybe once it was defeated by Nika, its legends lived on, which, like Nika, gave birth to another fruit based on the legends about this entity, which then gave anyone who ate this entity's fruit the power of the entity, or at least the presumed folklorish abilities of the entity, which is why we see Nika fighting a devil at the end of the mural in the Third World. But that's to be, I guess, determined. But anyway, so the entity that Moria is talking about is older than the mural. And we know that that is not Ors, nor is that reference to Ors Jr. Their clan may be, but neither of them, because one, Little Ors Jr. is 72 years old. Meaning, given that giants like Road or Loki are only 63, that means that he is maybe in his 20s or 30s, right? Then, looking at the Ors that we see in Thornbark, the zombie, at his death, he was only 159 years old. So, I'm not really sure if that lines up in the timeline. And given that he couldn't split Thriller Bark by simply punching it, makes me believe that the legend that Moria is speaking on isn't about him. It could be his father, it could be his grandfather, but I don't think there's a lot of evidence that it's pointing to him, especially seeing as how we know he just died from the cold, but still, he should be older or stronger than what he is. And we know strength is retained in the corpse of the person, given what we see from Ryuma. Ryuma had long since been dead, but after he was given Brook's shadow, he could do things that Brook himself could not do. And just to point out, like Ors, Ryuma's body was preserved because Ryuma was buried in Ringo, which is a very cold place in Wano. So like Ors, who died in the cold, Ryuma's body too was well preserved. Therefore, there was no deterioration or a lack of deterioration, which means the strength of the body should have been retained. Like, for example, and I mentioned this in a video a while ago, and it's very interesting, that one of Brook's maneuvers he performs, and when he does it, which is a thrust, it comes out like a rifle shot. And at that time, Brook could not do that. So I said to say that if this was the Ors that Moria was talking about, he will be a lot more dangerous than what we see in the events of Thriller Bark, especially seeing as how Ryuma and Oars have their bodies preserved in the same way. And then Ryuma was proven to be stronger than Brook at that time using Brook's shadow. So I say that to say there shouldn't be that sharp of a fall off in strength when the bodies of these two beings were well preserved. Of course, they wouldn't be as strong as they were in life, but seeing as how Oars presumably is being called the continent puller, he shouldn't have this vast drop off in strength to a point where he can't even affect Thriller Bark. But however, taking into consideration that this entity that Moria is talking about is older and led to the power that is presumably being on display in the mural, I will say that I do think that this is the ultimate villain that Luffy will fight in the future, and this is the ultimate biblical nemesis of Nika. So to break down what I just said, I think that the story Moria is talking about relates to the legends that gave birth to the entity that we see in the mural. I think those legends were based off of the ancestor of Oars at some point, an old evil of which needed to be vanquished by Nika. Then those legends perhaps rebirth said entity, and now it was a stronger version than it was before because it is no longer a person. It is the dreams and desires of people manifest into this biblically terrifying entity that very well may be the devil of One Piece. With that being said, I would also like to say that the reason why I think Blackbeard himself is going to get this fruit is again because of people that he meets throughout the story of One Piece. Like I just said, he captured Moria. Moria serves as an introduction to this entity. Blackbeard is also the subject of conversation during Thriller Bark because that's when we get the bounty drop for him, which is 0, and that's when we know that he has become a warlord. Talking about that, he got his warlord status and used it to do what? He used it to break into Impel Down. What are the levels of Impel Down called? They're usually called Hell, right? Levels of Hell. Who is the chief of Impel Down? Magellan. Now, why is Magellan important? Magellan, even though he's not a devil, he is dressed like a devil, much like the entity that we see in the mural. And no one else in the world is dressed in this getup but him. Like tit for tat, like down to the nines, he looks like a devil. He's got the wings, he's got the horns, and they're all a part of his uniform. The horns are not real. They are headpieces that he pops off during his fight with Luffy to put on his hands so that he can have pincers, right? So they're not real. And we know from Betham, Mr. 2, turning into Magellan towards the end of the arc that the wings are a part of his uniform. They too are not real. But with that being said, what does Blackbeard do after he's nearly taken out by Magellan? He goes down to the deepest level of hell, level 6, which is a hidden level, and he beats Magellan. He defeats the devil in hell and then frees the demons of hell to be a part of his crew. Because the people of level 6 are those who have been removed from history because their crimes are so heinous. And on top of that, which is a bit of an aside, so I guess it really doesn't matter, but I just think it's interesting. One of the so-called demons that he frees from hell is San Juan Wolf, the colossal battleship and the biggest person in history, whom is a giant. So I find it funny that we're talking about an ancient giant in Oars or the Oars clan of humongous proportions, and he, Blackbeard, frees a person who is on record the biggest person in history, who is also a giant, from level 6 to be a part of his crew, and whom is now one of his 10 Titanic captains. I just find that very interesting within itself. What's also interesting about this too, and you can take this in any way you want, but I do find it interesting that there is a freezing hell in Impel Down, and then he ultimately gets someone who has the power of ice in his main cabinet, who ends up being the 10th Titanic captain of his whole armada, whom is former Admiral Kuzan, also known as Aokiji. So that too is interesting, that once he becomes a proper Emperor of the Sea, a Yonko, he not only has the demons of hell at his beck and call, but he technically has an entire level of hell on his side in Kuzan. So going back to Blackbeard's warlord status, how did he become a warlord? Well, he beat Porgas the Ace of the Whitebeard Pirates. The funny thing about this is that this happened 16 chapters before Moria tells us a story about Oars. But in the fight that happens in chapter 440 that goes on to chapter 441, we see that Blackbeard has the power of the Darkness fruit, a Logia type devil fruit that allows him to become darkness. In becoming darkness, he has the ability to nullify other devil fruit powers simply by touching the devil fruit user in question. This gives the Darkness fruit a certain dominion over all other devil fruits because it is the only power that allows him to do this. We also find out that he learned about this ability from the Devil Fruit Encyclopedia long ago. With that being said, it's very interesting then the final clash between himself and Ace. Ace uses a attack called Great Flame Commanded Flame Emperor, which is a giant fireball that resembles a sun. Blackbeard presumably swallows this whole thing up using his darkness. I find it very peculiar, given the circumstances here, that the demonic figure in the mural is holding a sun. So this fight, or this final clash in the fight between Blackbeard and Ace, could be a analog to the mural that we see in chapter 1138, because we see this giant demonic figure holding a sun as he's fighting the sun deity. So that communicates to the reader that this being must be a being of darkness, as he's trying to keep the light from the people, and then the sun deity has to then combat him. He's holding the sun in his hand. So taking that into consideration, the fight between Blackbeard and Ace could be an analog to the mural, because Blackbeard literally snuffs out a light in beating Ace, a fire man, by actually consuming his fire and throwing him in jail. So that's what I think. And of course, Ace then meets his demise in Marineford. But in talking about Marineford actually, and going back to Thriller Bark, I can't help but notice there's a very interesting parallel with quite a few characters. Now, when you look at Oars, Oars is an ancient giant wearing a belt and loincloth. Said belt has 3 skulls on it. That is very interesting. And then the loincloth has a cross. Now, I don't necessarily think the cross is that important, but it does remind me of crossbones. I'll just say that. But it's very interesting that his belt has 3 skulls on it. This then is repeated in Marineford when we see Little Oars Jr. or Oars the Third, because then he has a necklace with 3 skulls on it. So this is a repeating pattern. Why is this important? Because, of course, it relates back to Blackbeard's Jolly Roger. So perhaps another symbol of the Jolly Roger as a whole is whatever the three skulls represent for this Oars tribe. Perhaps it is a symbol of dominance for them, which is why both known members of said Oars tribe have three skulls on their person in different places. This makes sense too when considering the legend that Moria says about Oars, or a member of the Oars clan, because he said he pulled continents and made his own nation of villains. Well, this does relate back to Blackbeard, because Blackbeard did defeat a former rocks pirate and take the pirate beehive Hachinoso, full of Lead Island, for himself to be his own base of operations. So I could believe that these two things are related. With that being said, I think this is going to be very important and is a strong boost to the theory that Blackbeard wishes to become the legend that Moria is talking about in Thriller Bark. As an aside, too, I find it very interesting that Moria himself could be an Oni, which means he could be related to ancient giants, which is very interesting that Blackbeard does indeed end up capturing him. Even though he escapes, it's still very interesting that Blackbeard again is related to yet another character that looks like a devil, like Oars Jr., like Magellan, and like Moria now. But continuing, talking about Moria, I think he could be a hint into what Blackbeard's final Dofru is going to be called. Because even though Moria's name is Gecko Moria, a gecko is a lizard, I think Blackbeard's fruit is going to have something to do with bats, as Moria is also associated with bats. He has a move called Brickback that he uses via his Shadow fruit, and one of his ships has a figurehead that's a giant vampire bat. With that being said, I think Blackbeard's Zoan Devil Fruit is going to be the mythical Bat Fruit model devil. With that being said, what's also very interesting about his fruit being a Bat fruit is because the Bat fruit is now a canonical Zoan Devil Fruit family now in the series, thanks to Stussy's power reveal on Egghead. With that being said, too, before Stussy was confirmed to have said Bat fruit, we did have a pre-existing one in the franchise overall, thanks to Patrick Redfield having the mythical variant of the Bat fruit model vampire. Even though Patrick Redfield is a non-canonical character, it's an interesting bit that he is an escapee from level 6. Oddly, too, in the dialogue of the video game, it seems as though Brooke knows who Patrick Redfield is, which is kind of weird, but we don't get much context to how he knows him or what that means, which then relates Patrick Redfield both to Thriller Bark and to Impel Down, which is very interesting because those are two prominent arcs that discuss Blackbeard or involve Blackbeard in some way. So that may mean nothing, but it is something to think about. So he is in an offshoot way related to Blackbeard, which I just find a very interesting thing, even though it's unclear whether video games matter a great deal or not, but who's to say? But with that being said, yes, I do think Blackbeard's final Devil Fruit will be the mythical Devil Fruit known as the Bat Fruit model devil. I think too, seeing as how the Bat Fruit was the last of the flying fruits to be revealed, that Blackbeard could have the ability to fly. And he would end up looking like, say, the devil from Cuphead, for example, with wings. This big black furry figure with wings that can fly and has horns, right? So he would look kind of like that, and a mixture of what Magellan is trying to look like. That's what I think. In addition, as far as powers are concerned, I think even though it's very hard to make out what's happening in the mirror of chapter 1138, perhaps this devil figure does have claws, as he does have free hands that are separated from his wings. And we know Blackbeard back in the day did use a clawed weapon. So perhaps that will be a callback to that, maybe. And then two, I'm thinking as far as mythical powers go, perhaps Blackbeard gains the ability to not be harmed by certain damage, because that is the one aspect that seems to be lacking thanks to the properties of the darkness fruit. He sucks in everything, even pain, and feels it more than the normal person would. So I would think that given that the devil in 1138 in the mural is holding a sun, perhaps this lends to him having some sort of invulnerability or high defense, because there really hasn't been a devil fruit that gives you some sort of magic and vulnerability. Endurance, yes, but not exactly invulnerability. So it would be interesting if a power were to give that property, especially to a person who feels more pain than the average person due to the effects of another devil fruit. But with that being said, that's all I have for you today. And yes, I think Blackbeard will ultimately have the bat fruit mythical model devil. And with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Waxing.